let's do it. Number 12, The Great British Bake Off. You think you know your country? You think you know that sleepy, crumpet-munching island with its polite cues and obsession with the weather? Wrong. You've been fooled, just like everyone else. For years, the world watched in quiet fascination as a nation of seemingly gentle souls engaged in a televised baking competition. What a wholesome, lovely thing, right? No drama, just cakes, except this was a front. A brilliant, buttery facade for a psychological warfare campaign so subtle, so insidious, you didn't even know you were a target. The contestants, you see, weren't just home bakers. They were sleeper agents, trained by MI6 to infiltrate our collective consciousness. Each episode was a meticulously crafted exercise in social conditioning. The technical challenges, they weren't about baking a perfect Victoria sponge. They were about testing the limits of our sanity. Think about it, a seemingly simple task, but with maddeningly vague instructions, designed to make you question your own reality. The constant polite smiles and gentle criticisms from the judges were a form of gaslighting. Oh, lovely color, but perhaps a touch underbaked, darling, is just the British way of saying, we know you are incompetent and we will watch you suffer. The real purpose? To normalize constant low-grade stress and anxiety, to make us believe that not being perfect is a personal failure, to turn us all into jittery, self-doubting messes who feel a sudden, inexplicable need to bake at 3 a.m. because we just had a nightmare about Paul Hollywood's stare. This wasn't a show, it was a societal psy-op designed to make us all feel like we're constantly failing to produce a flawless lemon meringue pie. Number 11, Project Mockingbird. Back in the day, if you told people that the CIA was secretly paying off journalists to spread propaganda, you'd be laughed out of the room. You'd be called a tinfoil hat-wearing lunatic who probably believes the moon landing was fake and that the government is full of lizard people. Well, grab your tinfoil hats, my friend, because this one is disturbingly true. Project Mockingbird wasn't a kooky fringe theory. It was a confirmed large-scale operation. The CIA, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to win the Cold War wasn't with bombs or spies, but by weaponizing information itself. They essentially bought our news. They recruited American journalists and media executives, hundreds of them, and paid them to parrot CIA talking points. They wrote articles, produced TV segments, and even created publishing companies, all with one goal: to manipulate public opinion, both at home and abroad. They used our most trusted sources of information against us. That respected war correspondent who always seemed to have the inside scoop, he was on the payroll. That seemingly objective news anchor, reading lines fed to him by the government. It's like finding out your favorite childhood cartoon character was secretly a product placement for a brand of cigarettes. This wasn't about catching spies. This was about hijacking our collective reality and building a narrative that served their interests. Basically, they were in the fake news business long before it was cool. Number 10, Operation Northwoods. You know that feeling when your friend tries to get you to go to a party by lying to you about how cool it's going to be, or about how your ex is going to be there, or something equally manipulative? Well, imagine if your friend was the US government, and the party was a war, and the lie was murdering your own citizens. Sounds insane, right? Something a Bond villain would dream up. But back in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military leaders in the country, actually proposed this. It was called Operation Northwoods, and it was a plan to stage fake terrorist attacks and other violent acts on American soil and then blame them on Cuba. The goal was to drum up public support for an invasion of Fidel Castro's Cuba. The plan included things like faking the hijacking of passenger planes, sinking a U.S. Navy ship, and even staging a Remember the Maine-style incident where they would blow up a ship in Guantanamo Bay and claim the Cubans did it. They literally wrote down plans for killing innocent people to justify a war. It was a massive conspiracy to deceive the American public into supporting a military conflict. The only reason it didn't happen is because President John F. Kennedy said, no, thanks. We're not going to be murdering our own people today. It's basically the ultimate, it was just a prank, bro, that thankfully never happened. But the fact that it was seriously considered is enough to make you wonder what other bad ideas were shut down just in the nick of time. Number 9. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. For decades, if you whispered about the government conducting unethical, non-consensual medical experiments on its own citizens, you'd be labeled as a paranoid crank. But the Tuskegee Syphilis Study wasn't a whisper. It was a screaming testament to human cruelty and institutional racism. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service told over 600 African American men in rural Alabama they were receiving free health care for bad blood. What they were really getting was a front row seat to their own slow, agonizing decline. Over 400 of these men had syphilis, and the government's grand plan wasn't to cure them. It was to watch what would happen if the disease went untreated. They were guinea pigs in a live-action science experiment. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the researchers actively prevented the men from getting it. They lied to them, withheld information, and ensured they never received the life-saving medicine that could have cured them. They didn't just passively observe, they actively intervened to keep these men sick and suffering. Family members got sick, wives got syphilis, children were born with congenital syphilis, all while the government took notes. It's the ultimate betrayal of trust, the medical community's version of a friend who invites you over for dinner and then sets your house on fire while you're eating. You think, surely this is a misunderstanding, and then you realize the flames are reaching the ceiling, and they're just calmly jotting down the burn time. Number 8. The CIA and LSD, the 1960s, a time of peace, love, and the CIA secretly dosing unsuspecting American citizens with LSD. Sounds like a scene from a bad psychedelic spy movie, right? But the CIA's mind control program, known as MKUltra, was a very real and very bizarre operation. They were obsessed with finding a truth serum, a way to control people's minds and extract information. Their weapon of choice? LSD. The logic, if you can call it that, was that by administering hallucinogens to people without their consent, they could break down their minds and rebuild them as they saw fit. They ran experiments on college students, mental patients, and even their own agents. They'd slip LSD into someone's drink and then watch, taking notes as the subject's reality dissolved into a kaleidoscopic nightmare. In one particularly dark incident, a scientist working for the military named Frank Olson was dosed with LSD without his knowledge. A few days later, he fell to his death from a 13th-story window. The government claimed it was a suicide, but his family always believed he was murdered. It's like a secret government project to create the ultimate party drug, but instead of making you dance, it makes you question the very fabric of reality and possibly jump out a window. Number 7. COINTELPRO. Imagine this, you're part of a political group you believe in. Maybe you're an activist, maybe you're a pacifist, maybe you're just a guy who hangs out with your friends and talks about politics. One day, you get a letter from the government saying they know all about your group. They know your friends, they know your ideas, they know what you had for breakfast. Sounds like something out of a George Orwell novel. But this was the reality for thousands of Americans during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The FBI's COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a massive, illegal, and covert operation designed to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize domestic political organizations. It wasn't about catching foreign spies. It was about targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war protesters, and other groups the government viewed as a threat. They used forged letters, planted informants, and psychological warfare to sow chaos and distrust. They tried to get Martin Luther King Jr. to commit suicide by sending him an anonymous letter calling him a fraud. They broke into offices, wiretapped phones, and created fake rivalries to tear apart groups from the inside. They didn't just monitor dissent, they actively tried to destroy it. It was basically a giant government-run Mean Girls program, but instead of gossip and lunch table drama, the stakes were a lot higher. Number 6, Operation Paperclip. Everyone loves a good redemption story. A villain sees the error of their ways and turns over a new leaf, using their skills for the good of humanity. The US government took this to a whole new level after World War II. They didn't just forgive and forget, they actively recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom were card-carrying Nazis, and brought them to the United States. If you told someone back then that the country that had just fought a world war to defeat Nazism was now secretly employing ex-Nazis, they would have probably told you to get a hobby. But that's exactly what happened with Operation Paperclip. The government decided that the Germans' expertise in things like rocketry and biological warfare was too valuable to be left to the Soviets. So they falsified their employment histories, scrubbed their records of any affiliation with the Nazi regime, and gave them new identities. These were the same people who had worked at concentration camps and conducted grotesque experiments on prisoners. But suddenly, they were American scientists working on the space race and other top-secret projects. It's like discovering that the chef at your favorite restaurant used to be a serial killer, but you just keep eating the food because it's really good. The entire operation was a massive documented cover-up that prioritized technological advancement over human decency and basic morality. Number 5, the Pentagon Papers. Before Edward Snowden, there was Daniel Ellsberg. For years, the official government narrative on the Vietnam War was one of cautious optimism. The war was going well, the end was in sight, and American involvement was justified and necessary. But if you were a paranoid anti-war protester, you might have suspected that the government was lying to you. And you would have been right. The Pentagon Papers weren't a conspiracy theory. They were a 7,000-page top-secret document that proved the U.S. government had been systematically lying to the American people for decades about its involvement in Vietnam. They showed that successive presidential administrations, from Truman to Johnson, had secretly expanded the war, bombed countries we claimed to be neutral, and misled the public about the true reasons for the conflict. The war wasn't about saving a country from communism. It was about preventing a humiliating American defeat. The documents revealed a secret history of deception, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident being used as a pretext for war to the fact that the government had no exit strategy. When the New York Times published the papers, the government tried to stop them, arguing it would harm national security. But a Supreme Court ruling upheld the newspaper's right to publish. The entire saga was a huge, undeniable, public admission that the U.S. government had been gaslighting its own citizens for years about one of the most important events in modern history. Number 4, the Church Committee. For a long time, if you suggested that the CIA and FBI were running amok, assassinating foreign leaders, plotting coups, and spying on American citizens, you'd be considered a nut job. But in 1975, the U.S. Senate formed the Church Committee, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The committee, led by Senator Frank Church, spent months investigating the intelligence community, and their report was a bombshell. It revealed a host of illegal and deeply disturbing activities, from the CIA's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro with exploding cigars and poison pens, to the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which we talked about earlier. They also found that the intelligence agencies had been spying on the private lives of American citizens, including journalists, civil rights leaders, and even members of Congress. They were opening people's mail, wiretapping their phones, and building massive databases of information on anyone they deemed subversive. The Church Committee's findings were a public confirmation of every paranoid conspiracy theorist's wildest dreams. It was a massive, bipartisan admission that the government's secret agencies had been operating outside the law for decades with little to no oversight. It's like finding out that your dog isn't just a dog. It's also the secret leader of a global crime syndicate that's been stealing your mail and plotting against your neighbors. Number 3, Operation Gladio. Imagine a secret NATO-backed army of spies and saboteurs hidden in plain sight across Europe, ready to launch guerrilla warfare in the event of a Soviet invasion. Now imagine that this same secret army was involved in terrorist attacks and political assassinations in their own countries. If you had floated that idea back in the 1970s, you'd be considered a far-left radical with a vivid imagination. But a few years later, the Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, confirmed it. The secret army was called Operation Gladio, and it was a real thing. It was part of a stay-behind network of secret militias established by NATO and the CIA in Western European countries after World War II. The official purpose was to prepare for a Soviet invasion, but the unofficial reality was a lot more sinister. Gladio members were allegedly involved in a string of terrorist attacks across Europe, which were then blamed on left-wing groups, with the goal of creating a strategy of tension to push public opinion to the right and prevent a communist takeover. In Italy, for example, the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed 85 people, was initially blamed on a neo-fascist group, but later evidence suggested that the bombing was part of the strategy of tension and had links to Gladio. This wasn't some rogue faction of extremists. It was a confirmed, state-sponsored clandestine army that was terrorizing its own citizens to achieve a political objective. It's like finding out that your neighborhood watch is actually a gang that's been setting off car alarms and egging houses to make everyone feel like they need more security. Number 2, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs is a name that lives in infamy, but what's often forgotten is just how big a lie the whole thing was. Back in 1961, if you'd told a normal American that their government was planning a full-scale invasion of Cuba, using a secret army of Cuban exiles, and that it was going to fail spectacularly, they would have said you were crazy. After all, the government was telling everyone a very different story. The official line was that the U.S. was merely supporting a spontaneous uprising of anti-Castro forces. They claimed it was a domestic matter and that the U.S. had no direct involvement. But the truth, which came out much later, was that the entire operation was planned, funded, and directed by the CIA. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro and install a new pro-American government. But the mission was an absolute disaster from the start. The army of Cuban exiles was poorly trained and outnumbered, and their landing was met with immediate resistance. They were captured or killed within 72 hours. The whole thing was a national embarrassment, a massive foreign policy failure, and a complete and total lie. It wasn't an organic uprising. It was a US-led invasion that was so incompetent it could be a scene in a comedy movie. This wasn't just a political miscalculation. It was a large-scale conspiracy to deceive the world about America's true intentions and involvement. Number 1, the CIA's war on drugs. For decades, the official government line was that the war on drugs was a noble cause, an effort to rid our society of dangerous narcotics and the criminals who peddle them. But if you were a skeptical individual back in the 1980s, you might have wondered if the whole thing was a front. You might have wondered if the CIA was secretly involved in drug trafficking to fund covert operations. And you would have been right. The Iran-Contra affair, which we all learned about in history class, was just the tip of the iceberg. It confirmed that the CIA was selling weapons to Iran to fund the Contras, a right-wing guerrilla group fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. But it went a step further. An investigative series by journalist Gary Webb called Dark Alliance revealed that the CIA was not only aware of drug trafficking by the Contras, but was actively facilitating it. The Contras were smuggling cocaine into the U.S. and selling it to drug dealers in Los Angeles, who then used the profits to buy weapons and fund their war. The CIA, in their quest to fight communism, had effectively become a drug cartel. This wasn't some fringe theory. It was a documented reality that the government denied for years. It showed that the very people who were supposed to be fighting the drug trade were secretly on the payroll. It's like finding out that your personal trainer is secretly in the business of selling donuts to all his clients. That's all for today. Stay tuned for similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.